I won't be speaking directly on my experiences in Gaza. I think that ground has been sufficiently covered. I want to look rather at what happened in Gaza and why now there's grounds for genuine hope that we can do something practical to effect change, maybe not end the occupation, but to at least make significant inroads in ending the occupation. The most remarkable aspect of the outcome of the Gaza massacre between December 27th and January 18th is that for the first time there was an unprecedented consensus of international outrage at what happened. And the obvious question is why? What happened in Gaza is certainly not the worst atrocity that Israel has committed in recent memory. There are people in this audience whose memories certainly go back to June 1982, when basically in the course of 3 weeks, Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. In the case of the recent Gaza massacre, the figure was about 1,400. Well, the obvious question is, then how do you account for this unprecedented consensus of outrage? And I think there are basically 3 reasons. Number one, as everyone in this room knows, there's been a gradual shift in public opinion over the past 20 years regarding Israel. Attitudes towards the Palestinians have not significantly changed, but attitudes towards Israel have significantly changed, especially in Europe, where, judging by the polls, Israel is the most hated country on earth. And the United States, judging from the recent polls, less than 50% of Americans supported the attack on Lebanon in summer 2006, and less than 50% of Americans supported the attack on Gaza during the past winter. Secondly, another aspect that's changed has been the sheer density of Israeli massacres. It's almost impossible, even for somebody who devotes his or her full conscious hours to following the conflict, to keep up with just the names of all the massacres. There's summer rains, autumn clouds, cast lead. If there were any truth, of course, they would be called Operation Attila the Hun, Operation Genghis Khan, and Operation Murder Incorporated. But they come with such rapidity of late that it's hard to keep up with them, and have also created a great deal of animus at Israel. And finally, in the case of the last massacre, there was just the sheer cowardice of it. Gaza was attacked not despite the fact, but because it was completely defenseless. And the Israelis completely understood that the Gazans didn't have the means, the wherewithal to resist the overwhelming firepower commanded by Israel. Now, the most striking place, in my opinion, that registered this consensus of outrage were the human rights organizations, the mainstream human rights organizations, which produced voluminous reports on the Gaza massacre. Amnesty International produced not one, but 2 massive reports on the Gaza massacre. Human Rights Watch produced not one, but 2 massive reports on the Gaza massacre. The Physicians for Human Rights in Israel also produced 2 reports. The National Lawyers Guild the UN Secretary General's office, the Arab League's Dugard Committee, and forthcoming the Goldstone Committee. Now, so far, most of you are probably thinking, so what? So many words, so many pieces of paper, so many trees lost. But there really is a so what. First of all, it was quite extraordinary how condemnatory these human rights organizations were of Israel. On every single aspect of Israel's propaganda, the human rights organizations categorically rejected all of Israel's claims. On the matter of their claim about giving warnings, on the destruction, the deaths, the use of white phosphorus, the human rights organizations across the board rejected all of Israel's defenses. Obviously, time doesn't allow me now to go through in any great detail, but I want to just read one particular point of these reports. As everybody knows, the main claim that Israel was making in defense of its attacks in Gaza, or in defense of the death and destruction which were wrought, was the claim that Hamas was using human shields. And that became almost a accepted wisdom of what happened in Gaza. So just allow me to quote from Amnesty International in its report that it released last week, in which it addressed in great detail this question of the human shields. It says, contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. It found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Excuse me, let me just take off these glasses. Nor that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. Amnesty International delegates interviewed many Palestinians who complained about Hamas's conduct, and especially about Hamas's repression and attacks against their opponents, including killings, torture, and arbitrary detentions, but did not receive any accounts of Hamas fighters having used them as human shields. In the cases investigated by Amnesty International of civilians killed in Israeli attacks, the deaths could not be explained as resulting from the presence of fighters shielding among civilians, as the Israeli army generally contends. And it goes on at some length. Well, what's most remarkable in all of these reports, and we have some veterans, I won't call them oldsters in the room, we have some veterans, they will remember back in 2 decades ago, you couldn't get Amnesty International to say one critical word about Israel. Everybody knew that Israel was engaged in widespread torture of Palestinian detainees. It had been copiously documented. When Amnesty International put out its volume Torture in the 1980s, they refused to even use the word torture when it came to Israel. And now you have a quite remarkable turn of events. I see in the audience Abdin Jabara, an old friend and comrade. Can you raise your hand? Okay. And Abdin will remember there was a time when the only ones who dared criticize Israel, and after a lot of internal dissension, was the National Lawyers Guild. So now I'll tell Abdin a funny story. So now I'll tell Abdin a funny story. Of all the reports that came out after the Gaza massacre, the most tepid and the most cautious was the National Lawyers Guild. The most they would say is there's prima facie evidence on the face of it, evidence that Israel committed significant violations of international law. But all the other reports, including Human Rights Watch, said Israel committed war crimes. Amnesty International, it barely had enough space to list all the war crimes that Israel committed. That's literally the case. And the Dugard Committee, and people have to keep in mind, John Dugard is a very respected mainstream legal scholar. The Dugard Committee went so far as to accuse Israel of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even entertained, it didn't accept, but entertained the idea that Israel was guilty of genocide. Well, that's a vast change in mainstream, what we can call enlightened public opinion. Now, what does that mean for all of us? I think it has important significance. And the significance, in my opinion, is this. Many of you are familiar with Gandhi's writings and his preachings about nonviolence. But Gandhi's preachings about nonviolence had two aspects to them. The first aspect, everybody knows, that you have to practice nonviolence for various reasons, although Gandhi had a lot of qualifications about practicing nonviolence. In my opinion, time doesn't allow me, there is grounds in Gandhi for supporting the rocket attacks on Israel, which preceded the attack. I don't have time to go into that during my prepared remarks, but I'd be happy to do so if you question me on it. But the more important point about Gandhi is, he said that it's not enough to have innocence of means, that is, to practice nonviolence. You also have to have innocence of ends, which basically means that your goal has to also be seen as legitimate by the whole of humankind, or most of humankind. If people don't see your goal as legitimate, then no matter how much nonviolence you practice, it's not going to convince people to act. I see Rosalind Paczewski in the audience, who's written a lot, I think, if my memory serves, on the abortion issue. And everybody understands that if pro-life persons were to go down in front of abortion clinics, and if they were to even go so far as to starve themselves to death, that's not going to change the mind of pro-choice people. They may feel a little sad that they starve themselves to death, maybe, but it's not going to change their opinion. You can only move public opinion to act if they agree on the legitimacy of your goal. If they accept the legitimacy of your goal, then nonviolence has real possibilities, potential, and prospects. Gandhi was once asked, why do you make public campaigns against alcoholism, but you don't make public campaigns against smoking? And his answer was, because smoking is respectable. People accept it. And you will never get them to act against a social ill unless there's a pre-existing consensus saying that ill is wrong. And now our great opportunity is that finally, after a long, hard struggle, the goals the Palestinians have set are now seen as legitimate, enlightened public opinion, as expressed whether it be in the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the human rights organizations. Enlightened public opinion is on the side of Palestinians. It's not any longer on the side of Israel, which means there's real possibilities for a Gandhian strategy of nonviolence to work, because you can have the innocence of means, that is to say nonviolence, and the innocence of ends. What the Palestinians want is seen by the whole of enlightened public opinion to be legitimate, reasonable, not extremist. And one of those legitimate aims is to end the siege, the illegal siege of Gaza. And that's the key word, illegal siege of Gaza. Amnesty International has called it a flagrant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Human Rights Watch has called it a serious violation of international law. That's just a euphemism for saying it's a war crime. And we have the possibility now of mobilizing international public opinion around ending the siege. And that's where we turn to the great and wonderful Medea Benjamin.